Hello, everyone. This is the 153rd episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview German journalist Mr. Harald Füner and Dr. Roland Löffler as we discuss Bayern Munich during the Paul Breitner, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, or the Breitnigge era from 1978 to 1983. Mr. Harald Füner is a German journalist at Hessischer Rundfunk, ARD, based in Frankfurt, while Dr. Roland Löffler is the director of the Saxon State Center for Political Education. Welcome to both of you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. Honor is mine. Can you each introduce yourselves and your trajectory and journey to football?
Roland, go ahead.
Yes, I think when I was a little boy, our parents always listened on Sunday morning to the radio shows, and that was a review of the Bundesliga of the day before. And Munich was very good in the 70s, so I liked it. Rummenigge, Beckenbauer, Meyer, who was a very funny guy. So I started to get enthusiastic. My father was a fan of Kaiserslautern, Franz Walter, and these sort of things. As a lot of little boys, I liked football. I liked Munich, and I bought football magazines, and I had a poster of Bayern Munich and of Rummenigge over my bed. And so soccer nostalgia really rings a bell. And thank you for the invitation. So I'm looking forward to looking back.
I grew up in Munich, apparently, in the 1970s, and I think it was back in 1975 that my dad took me for the first time to the Olympic Stadium in Munich. And I think we were watching Bayern against Schalke. I was only at the age of 4, and the only thing I can remember that I was shouting all the time, Beckenbauer, Beckenbauer, or Müller. But that was just one time. But then when we moved away from Munich in 1979, my best friend gave me as a farewell present a little Bayern Munich bag. And I was so fond of that, and I listened since then, since I was 8 or 9 at that time. So really, when I got engaged with Bayern Munich, that was in 1980, 1981. So really the Breitnigge era. And but then we lived near Bonn in the Rhineland, so far away from Munich, but still, I felt kind of special, yeah, to support a club that was not Cologne or not Mönchengladbach or not Borussia Dortmund, which are all based in the west of Germany, but that I was a Bayern Munich supporter at that time, and so came that I really got interested into that era, and then followed and also went to a couple of away games at that time, at that era.
Let's go back in time. Can you describe the status of Bayern Munich in the post 1976 Champions Cup era and the departure of Franz Beckenbauer in 1977 to New York Cosmos?
Well, of course, losing Franz Beckenbauer was a big step for Bayern Munich. They really were lacking then the leader of the team. I mean, they had Sepp Maier in goal, they still had Müller, they had the upcoming Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, but who was at that time still called a Chancentod in Germany. You know, he missed a lot of goals at that time. So they came in a kind of decline, and under manager Detmar Kramer, they did not really work very well. For 2 consecutive seasons, Borussia Mönchengladbach won the title in 75 and 76, and then also in 77. So, yeah, Bayern had lost the status as being the number one in Germany. The club was in a kind of decline at that time, yeah.
Let's discuss our two main protagonists. Let's start with Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. Can you describe his trajectory up to 1978?
Yes, Rummenigge was born in East Westphalia in Lippstadt. That was a small town. And talent was discovered quite early. I think his father was a bank director at the local bank. Very tiny little town, quite important for automotive industry. And then he got the chance due to his talent to go to Bayern Munich. And the story always goes at the beginning, he was very nervous very shy with all these giants of football. But then in the first weeks, he started to get more confident, and due to his outstanding technique, he could compete with these guys in the training zone, and he could develop further and further, and was regarded as one of the great talents for the post-Beckenbauer era. Then, as Harald said in the beginning, he was not that successful in scoring. I mean, that came to 1979, 1980. Bayern Munich put a lot of hope in him that he could be a certain figure for the next era. He played in 78 the Argentina World Cup with good and bad sides. I think against Mexico he was very successful, and then the rest of the World Championship for Germany was not that good. But he showed up on the international level for the first time, so the people had a certain impression of him. But what he was lacking, and this is, I mean, had to do with Breitnigge, that Bayern Munich lost brain, the leader in the midfield, a structure in the team. And I think it was not just decline. I mean, sometimes I would say the old Bayern Munich, everything has his time, and the time was over for the very outstanding world-class team. And then as Harald said, they lost a couple of times in the championship, and they needed a new structure. And that came in with Paul Breitner as a coach and Breitner. And then Rummenigge really had a big breakthrough. At least so how I remember things.
Yeah. I mean, in looking back to that time, I mean, Bayern signed him in 1974 just for the sum of 10,000 Deutschmarks. And if you look at it, 10 years later, he went for 10 million Deutschmarks away to Inter Milan. So, I mean, economy-wise or money-wise, that was like the big step or the big money business that Uli Hoeneß, well, got out of the deal later on, and which also probably lay a bit the fundament for the later success also of the club. Yeah.
What was the trajectory of Paul Breitner? There was his spell away from Bayern for a number of years at Real Madrid, and the circumstances of his return in 1978.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Breitner, of course, he had also won the World Cup in 1974, and he was a young player, the same age as Uli Hoeneß, promising guy. But he had played in his first spell with Bayern just as a defender, most of the times left defender. Okay, scoring, for example, even the goal in the World Cup final in 1974, the penalty, and another few good shots he had during this World Cup. But he was more considered as a defender and not as a dominant player in midfield. And I think he grew through into that new position, into that new role during his time at Real Madrid. And coming back to Germany, he was signed by Eintracht Braunschweig in 1978, late coming back from Spain. Because Braunschweig at that time had a very big sponsor and putting a lot of money in, and he played for a year there. And there he was also like the leader in midfield. And then I think Bayern did the very important step to sign him then back to Bayern Munich, also to play this dominant role in midfield. But I think through his time in Spain at Real Madrid, he really came into this position to play very dominant and to play on a very high level.
As far as management, can you summarize the post Udo Lattek era and the managerial changes until 1978?
Yeah, I think Bayern Munich was not that lucky. Perhaps you know more the details than I do, Harald, but
Yeah.
they had Kramer, that was called the football professor. I mean, he gained two, today we call it championships, Landesmeister title. He never won a national title. I think he was very important to bring Bayern on the international level. And then they had a lot of changes with Lorand. It never succeeded really. And I think there was some uneasiness in the club and also a lack of luck. And then, I mean, Gladbach had an excellent time, excellent players, Weisweiler and other guys. And then that was the big opponent. So one club was going up and the other club was going down. And I think often with clubs, it's a question of mixture, that you have good players and a good coach, good so technical, financial management, which came up then later with Uli Hoeneß. So they needed some years to recover to find the right combination to have success.
They finished as low as 12th in 1978.
Yeah,
That's true. I think that the funny thing was that Detmar Kramer, as you mentioned, he won twice the
nice.
Champions League, yeah, the European Cup of the Landesmeister, but in the league it didn't work out. And then he went into this season, 77, 78, and it was getting worse and worse. And then for the first time in German history, it came to
Yeah.
this very funny managerial swap. Like Detmar Kramer, because not being very successful at Bayern Munich, was transferred to Eintracht Frankfurt. And at the same time, Frankfurt, there was Gyula Lorand, the manager, and he at the same time changed from Frankfurt to Bayern Munich. So I think that's very unique also in football history that two clubs just swapped their managers. Then Gyula Lorand took over with Paul Czernay as its assistant trainer, assistant coach. But yeah, Gyula Lorand also, well, didn't get along with all the players there. I think they were really lacking structure. They had a couple of Swedish internationals, Torstensson and some others, but there was no real structure there anymore. After Beckenbauer had left, they still had the old guys like Schwarzenbeck and Meyer in goal, but in midfield and also up front, Gerd Müller was also aging and didn't score that many goals as he did before. So this was all fading out a little bit, and Gyula Lorand didn't really get a grip on the team, and so he was also sacked then in this very disastrous season in 1978 when they only became 12th in the Bundesliga.
And they did not perform on the European level for a year. Unbelievable these days, isn't it?
Yeah. Didn't even reach the UEFA Cup.
No.
What was the backbone of the side upon Breitner's return in 1978?
Well, I think he was bought in Eintracht Braunschweig. That was not the place he wanted to be. And I think the integration in Braunschweig didn't work out. I think he earned, for that time, a lot of money. Then I think, the old boys connection that still works with Bayern Munich, that they remembered him. Breitner was always a kind of intellectual and very critical, not easygoing personality. So one has to make a decision. If you take him, you get a lot of trouble, but also a lot of quality. And I think, as Harald mentioned, he had developed further during the Real Madrid years. I think when he wanted to return to Germany, the market was not so much open. And then Braunschweig came with, I think, 400,000 Deutschmark that days. But that was a provincial club, so he was yearning for a greater platform. And I think Bayern could open this and had a little risk, but the risk, it worked out. He had some injuries, but he got stabilized. And I think he got the recognition he was looking for in the early 70s. Yeah? He became the captain after a while. As I said, the brain in the midfield. And I think that's what he liked. And I think he had a good end of his career for 3-4 years in Munich.
Absolutely. But I think also the signing has to do with like Uli Hoeneß. Uli Hoeneß had taken over the manager post from Robert Schwan. And Robert Schwan had back in the 70s, of course, also kind of dubious role at Bayern Munich. Was the personal manager of Franz Beckenbauer. Then, of course, also in charge for transferring him to Cosmos New York. But at the same time, signing other players. And, when Schwan dropped out as manager of Bayern Munich, I think it was, and we know it nowadays, Uli Hoeneß was the blessing for the club, to bring Bayern Munich would never be in the position it is today if not Uli Hoeneß had taken over after his injury, the job at Bayern Munich as a manager. Because he's the same age as Paul Breitner, and he knew they had won together a couple of titles, and I think he knew that with the coming in of Paul Breitner, this team would get a good structure.
As far as the team in place, you still have aging stars like Sepp Maier, Schwarzenbeck, Gerd Müller, but there's younger players like Klaus Augenthaler, Kurt Niedermayer. You still have the Yugoslavian midfielder Branko Oblak, Bernd Durnberger, and of course Rummenigge up front. with the likes of Norbert Jansson. Was it self-evident that Breitner, along with Rummenigge, would be the new kingpins of this team? And when was it clear, as far as the media, to name this duo Breitnigge?
You know when it happened, Roland?
No, I'm not totally sure. I think 81 or 82, but you are the journalist.
Yeah, well, I know it. I know it for sure. The
You
nickname
did it.
Breitnigge because I was at the game where this name was made up, and the next day the Bild Zeitung had the big letters Breitnigge on the top. That was the 33rd match day of the season 80-81. It was in May
Okay.
1981, and Bayern Munich was playing in Mönchengladbach. And
Okay.
I sat on the main stand with my father, and we watched the game. And in that game, Bayern won 4-1 at the Bökelberg and became, through that win, German champions again in 1981.
Hmm.
And Rummenigge scored 3 goals. Niedermeyer scored the fourth one. And well, the 4-1, that was the incredible goal because Breitner and Rummenigge played 4 times a 1-2, a double pass. Through the whole of the midfield, from their own defense, they did 4 times a double pass, and Rummenigge came up into the box up front and scored the 4-1. And then the next day, the Bild Zeitung, the boulevard newspaper in
Okay.
Germany, had the big cop, Breitnigge, securing the second championship in a row for Bayern Munich. So that was that very match when they coined this nickname for the duo. But so that was, I mean, they were already successful, of course, in also in the season 79 and 80. And Rummenigge also then scored a lot of goals, 26 in the season 80, and but then 29 in the following season when they became again German champions in 1981.
Great memories. Yes. And now, when you tell us, I can remember it, but wouldn't have thought directly.
I wouldn't know it, but I wasn't at very many games during those days. But that very day, because my father knew I was a very tough Bayern supporter at that time at the age of 10, and he said, how maybe they become champions then on the Bökelberg. So he got some tickets,
Hmm.
and we drove up from Bonn to Mönchengladbach, which is about an hour's drive, and then we watched that game,
Hmm.
and it was really worth it.
Let's look at Breitner's first season back to Bayern, the 1978-79 season. As far as transfers, in addition to Breitner, Bayern also signed Dutch defender Martin Jol from Den Haag, future Tottenham manager. As far as the players leaving, you have later in the season, I think in October, Uli Hoeneß joins Nuremberg for a short spell. And also, it's during this season that Gyula Laurent is sacked in December, and his assistant Paul Czernay becomes the manager. Bayern would finish fourth behind Hamburg and Stuttgart and Kaiserslautern, but it was already an improvement to the previous season. Was Breitner's impact immediate in that sense?
I would say so. He also had at that time, of course, a very good midfielder like Oblak next to him, who could also steer the game. And Niedermeyer had come from Stuttgart, so they had a bit more structure in midfield. But Breitner really played in central midfield. He wasn't a defender as he used to be in his first spell at Bayern, and I think he made a very good impact to bring Bayern back up onto the level to compete at least with Hamburg for the championship.
Speaking of Paul Czernay, can you discuss his trajectory and the circumstances of his appointment in December 1978?
I cannot do that directly, but here in one of my old magazines, I found quite an interesting quote that he complained firstly as an observer, as an assistant manager from other teams, that Bayern Munich tried in the late 70s only with nice technical football to succeed, and they failed. So he realized when he took over the job, first as an assistant coach and then as the head coach, that they have to fight again, that they have to run again, that the basics of football have to be restored. And that was his attitude to come in. So back to the basics. And perhaps it's, in the last years, I mean, the big guys got older, perhaps also a little bit arrogant, and they were not hungry enough to get the full success. I mean, they had won everything. So what should they do in the future? So that is one point. The other point is, I mean, it's called the PAL system. He changed the playing system, the structure of the system. I don't know the English term, I think, away from the man to the zone orientated defense. And if you do so, you need also technically skilled players, but also players with a good condition. We see these days at the Guardiola style. But Palciana was one of the people who introduced the zone-orientated football. The Dutch coaches, Rinus Michels or Happel did so too. And I think the changes in the team of Bayern Munich step by step was very interesting. I mean, they had Breitner. They took Kraus, I think, from Frankfurt, who was a very talented, gifted player. They had Oblak, who was, I saw him also once when I was a little boy, a real fighter. Yeah. Then they had the old guys, Dürnberger and Dremmler, who had a great condition. And then I also think it's very important that they took Dieter Hoeneß as, so to say, the counterpart to Rummenigge. Rummenigge, the big dribbler with a unique technique, and then the specialist for heading with Dieter Hoeneß, more physical. And there, it was a totally different team to the mid-70s, but there was an idea behind. And I think this is the big success of Ternay together with Uli Hoeneß, to find good players that fit together, a new philosophy, zone-orientated. Only a couple of teams in Germany were able to play this way. And so step by step, perhaps not in the beginning, but later on, then they won the two big national titles. And that was the breakthrough also for Rummenigge.
I think it was also that in defense, Bayern had, of course, been focusing on the libero, on Franz Beckenbauer as being the libero, the liberal, the central defender who could go out into midfield, etc. And then always another defender, a Vorstopper in front of him for keeping the opponents away. But he changed also the style of playing of Bayern Munich. And he had then also like the defenders on the left, like Udo Horstmann or Wolfgang Dremmler on the right side. They were now also allowed to go up on the flanks, to go up front and put in a cross. So he really changed also the style of play at Bayern Munich. And for example, players like Udo Horstmann, I think they also played a very important role in getting again the success and winning the titles in 1980 and 81.
What was more important, the change in the tactics or Breitner's drive?
Doesn't it fit together? I mean, in a way, you could say, I mean, Beckenbauer was the main director of the game, but from far off, and then he went step by step through the midfield and made the passes. And now with Breitner, you put the directing figure more in the center of the game, and that also meant that you had changed the defense role. I mean, they had Hanne Weiner, who played something like a libero. Then Augenthaler was developing. I also like Niedermeyer. I mean, he was a very intelligent guy, more defense, if I remember correctly. That was not this splendid aura of the early 70s, but quite sober and intelligent players. So I would say it's a mixture of both, the system and the players. Breitner was the last puzzle piece into a new puzzle. And I mean, they had luck because he often was injured before, and he was relatively stable, not always, but relatively stable. And so it worked out. I mean, they made some not so successful drafts with Del Haye or something, a big talent who never succeeded in Munich. But I mean, Breitner was stable. He got the recognition and he had the skills and he loved it. And he was very eager to get the title and then also to go to the World Championship in 82. Again, I think that calmed his soul because with the national teams, it was not always fruitful and happy time with him.
Can you describe further Breitner's evolution? As we stated, he was initially a left back, but the Breitner version 2.0 was this midfielder. So how would you describe this contrast? Tough question, like which version was better, the defender or the midfielder?
In my point of view, I think it's the midfielder because then he really made an impact. And I think without Breitner, we wouldn't have won the championships in 1980 and 1981. In the beginning of the 70s, remembering sometimes he came up front, sometimes he was allowed to take the shot or take the free kick or take a penalty because his shooting abilities were already very good in young ages. But then this developing the game and also playing the passes. I think that was the big thing later on. And I think which he really learned at Real Madrid. And there he shifted up also more into midfield. So I think he got more ability to steer the game. And therefore, I think his second spell at Bayern and the two titles in 1980, 81, and the cup winning in 1982, I think that is part of the honor that he really deserves and which made him then also an icon at the club, at Bayern Munich. I think just looking at his first spell, he was a young player, and in those times, then the players like Beckenbauer, Meyer, or Müller dominated. But at that time, 80, 81, that was really, the Breitner era.
I think it's a very difficult question because I think when Uli Hoeneß and Breitner joined Bayern Munich for the first time, I think they were quite important too. They were both very quick, very talented, and a bit naughty, a bit aggressive, challenging those guys who had won the first titles. And so I think even in the first period of his career, he had an impact, and he became world champion. Perhaps he was relieved from too much defense, but I had in mind the defense is important when he became the late Breitner. I think for the legendary status, I'm totally with Harald. I think these last, how long was it? 3-4 years were more important than the beginning. And this combination, sometimes even in his late years, he could be very quick, rushing through midfield, getting the pass to Rummenigge, pushing the Dieter Hoeneß also. And as a personality, the first period he was one of the 11, perhaps the intellectual left-wing nonconformist. But in the last period, he was like a good wine. Everything centered on him, and he got a little bit ripe and bright, and everyone looked at him, and I think that is a special role which he played in the last period.
You already touched up on this. At the end of the season in 1979, Uli Hoeneß retired as a player and immediately became Bayern Munich's general manager. Being the brand name that Bayern Munich has become today, a lot has to do with Uli Hoeneß's management of the team since then. But how important was this decision at that time for such a young, I guess still he would have been in his 30s, I imagine, at this point, to take this key role, be part of Bayern's reemergence?
Very important, no?
Yes.
I think it was in his late 20s. He had hasn't he had also an accident and couldn't play anymore. And I think he had a genius, an economical genius, that he realized that he has to restructure the club. And I mean, he was very penetrating with his ideas, and he was a manager in the best sense that he had an understanding of both the sport.
Was this noticeable in the early going as well, all these things you're saying, or did it come with time?
No, I think regarding sponsoring, I think he managed with the main sponsor, Magirus Deutz, a company for lorries, that he could buy Breitner, and that he made very good contracts for Bayern Munich. And I think he had an idea that it is really a brand. And then later on, together with his big opponent from Werder Bremen, Willy Lemke, they understood that they have to sell TV rights. And later on, he realized that merchandising is very important. You know, when you said you had been a young boy in watching the games, I was a young student when I did an internship at Süddeutsche Zeitung, and I was sitting next to Uli Hoeneß when they opened the first merchandising shop in the center of Munich with Olaf Thon. So years later, then we went to a beer, whatever Brauhaus, and then he said, you know, we slowly start with merchandising. Perhaps once in a while we will earn 1 million, and perhaps we can buy one player once. Perhaps, yeah. Later on, it's everything with merchandising. Yeah. I think he had a really good understanding how you sell the product and how to get the best players. And then he made this strategy, which I often find annoying. He was always looking who are the best players in Germany from the other clubs to destroy the other clubs' quality, bring it to Bayern Munich, and Bayern Munich is the backbone of the national team, and the strategy works until today in a way. So weaken the opponent and make the best and be totally egotistic for your club, and success is right. But I see these days, I think Uli Hoeneß is a big obstacle for Bayern Munich to develop further because he's still too influential and the next generation has a big problem. But that's far away from your question.
Well, I think he was very important, and as you mentioned, doing these sponsoring deals, but then also moving on after he saw Magirus Deutz or Iveco Magirus, was out. Then he saw, oh, Commodore computers are there. Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
we take them as a shirt sponsor. And then he went on to get Opel involved. And Opel at that time, at the end of the 80s, 1980s, was a huge sponsor at AC Milan and other clubs. So he really tried to get the big brands into Bayern Munich. And if you see nowadays, also those companies who are allowed to hold some of the Bayern shares, 10% of the Bayern shares. Well, those are the big clubs or the big companies like Allianz, like Audi. Then the big sponsor deal
Telekom.
with Deutsche Telekom, which has been going on now for, I think, over 2 decades now already. So he has really said, okay, we want to be a top brand and we need top brands to be our partners and to work with us. I think also the move you just mentioned, the first fan shop after he retired after the World Cup 1990 or the beginning of the 90s, he was only playing then in the reserve team of Bayern Munich, was Hansi Pflügler, one of the
Yeah.
World Cup heroes of 1990. And then after the World Cup 1990, when Pflügler said, "Oh, I want to retire," he made him the boss of the fan shop of Bayern Munich
And
and
this
gave
very day, and this
yeah, and
very day.
until this very day, and gave him a contract, I think with a rule of like, I don't know, 1% of the proceedings or whatever, or 0.5% or something. But anyway, at the end of the 90s, Hansi Pflügler was the best earning person at Bayern Munich because they developed so quickly these merchandising activities and setting up fan shops everywhere, not only at Munich Hauptbahnhof or in Munich, various fan shops, but you find them worldwide nowadays. Yeah, this merchandising, I think that is really something Uli Hoeneß had there in mind, and also trying to involve former players, yeah, who are part of the Bayern Munich family. I think that's also one of the secrets that Uli Hoeneß always tried to put on for the club, to integrate important people if they go conform with him, or if they go conform with him. There's, for example, a player like Lothar Matthäus, the German record international, where he once said, well, Lothar Matthäus will never be a manager of this club and he won't even be the greenkeeper at our stadiums. Since that day and since that interview on Deutsche Sportfernsehen, it was clear that Lothar Matthäus would never get an important role at the club. But other players like Raimund Aumann, who is still the former goalkeeper, who is still nowadays in charge of all the fan clubs and things like that, Hoeneß really tried to integrate the whole of of former players and of players who stick to this Bayern Munich family. And I think that has made him very important. If that is a concept for the future, we will see, and whether now the new managers will see it differently. But I think that is still this attitude that the club still has. We care about our former players and we also give them job opportunities later on.
We come to the 1979-80 season with Bayern back to the top and winning the Bundesliga again. First time since 1974. As far as the players leaving, Gerd Müller finally leaves Bayern Munich to go to the NASL, to Fort Lauderdale Strikers in the United States. You also have Jupp Kappelmann going to Munich 1860. Martin Jol leaves after a season, goes back to Netherlands to Twente and Skede. You also have new arrivals like Hans Wiener from Hertha Berlin, Wolfgang Kraus, midfielder, comes from Eintracht Frankfurt. Dieter Hoeneß, brother of Uli Hoeneß, comes from Stuttgart. Wolfgang Dremmler comes from Eintracht Braunschweig. As well as later in the season, Norwegian defender Einar As. However, the transfer activity is somewhat overshadowed with the car accident of Sepp Maier that derails his career and he's forced to retire shortly thereafter.
I was a young kid and I remember that evening when it was even the top news in the Tagesschau in German on German television news. Oh, Sepp Maier had a car accident and is seriously injured. And when it was clear that he would not come back, of course, Bayern Munich had big troubles on this goalkeeper position. They only had this young Walter Junghans, who had been the reserve keeper from Hamburg. And I remember very well, I think in that season, 1979-80, well, he was thrown in. He had to do some goalkeeper. But later on, they also signed up Manfred Müller from Nuremberg, who then stepped in, I think, a year later to replace Walter Junghans more often. So really on that goalkeeper position, I think they had, of course, some serious problems after Maier could not play from one day to the other.
In a narrow race, they edged ahead of SV Hamburg to win the title by 2 points. They also advanced up to the semifinals, I believe, of the UEFA Cup before being eliminated by Eintracht Frankfurt. So how would you describe the successful season?
You mentioned some very interesting points. You could see they were successful, but they were not as stable as a little bit later. I mean, Hamburg was a great club at that time. They won the European Cup of Cup winners. They had Kevin Keegan, a master transfer, which Keegan had some problems in the beginning and at the end. But in between, he was one of the big European stars ever at that time. And in Hamburg, they loved him. They won titles and became then, after the 2 years of Bayern Munich successes, the big opponent. I think Bayern Munich won with 2 points difference, the 1979, 1980 competition. Frankfurt, that was a little bit a miracle. I mean, that was a tough game, and Friedel Rausch did good coaching out of a sudden. I mean, Frankfurt had a good team at that time, too. They won, I think, 3 times the cup. And never the national title, but it was really an okay team with 2 world champions, Grabowski and Hölzenbein. It was an interesting competition, but it could have been also gone the other way. And so I think the title stabilized this new team with Breitner, with Rummenigge, Peter Hoeneß, Kraus, and then the next year they become stronger and stronger. And I think for Rummenigge, it was a big breakthrough. He won the title of the best scorer of the year. And the first time he was not the Chancentod, but he scored, I think, 26 goals. So that was quite magnificent and set standards.
Yeah, I think it was very remarkable that they won the championship because I think in that very season, 1979, 1980, German football really dominated Europe at that time. I mean, if you think about it, in the quarterfinal of the UEFA Cup, out of the 8 teams, there were 5 from Germany. So really, Bayern had to eliminate in the quarterfinal Kaiserslautern. And then the semi-final was Eintracht Frankfurt against Bayern Munich and Borussia Mönchengladbach against VfB Stuttgart. So there were 4 German teams in the semi-final of the UEFA Cup. And so, I mean, each one of them was good.
And Hamburg reached the finals of the Champions Cup as
that's
well.
right. And they only lost narrowly in the Bernabeu Stadium in Madrid to Nottingham Forest, who was, of course, a great team at that time with Peter Shilton in goal
Peter Schön,
and a very big team. But Hamburg also, I think at that time, after the championship in 1979, still had a very, very high quality. Otherwise, they wouldn't have reached the Champions League final in that year. So I think it's very remarkable if you see that Bayern then won with this new team, the German championship, because all of the German teams were really good at that time, if you see how they competed on European level.
So where Bayern now seem to be back to where they were a few years back, would there be comparisons with the 70s team around this time with the title win, or the 70s team is regarded as untouchable?
I think the 70s was untouchable. I mean, if you think how they competed in 1974, winning the German title, the Landesmeister, the Champions League title on European level, and six Bayern players were in the World Cup winning team. So I think they were even broader. And in the year 1979-80, it was well, they had the two very good stars like Breitner and Rummenigge. But as I mentioned, on goalkeeping position, they had some problems. They had some talented players. They got in Dremmler from Braunschweig. They had Udo Horstmann. They had good young players. But Weiner, of course, he was always regarded as, oh, is this now the new Beckenbauer? But of course, he didn't have the quality of a Franz Beckenbauer at that time. So I think from the quality standard, I think the 1974 team was higher than that in 1980 or 1981. Yeah.
I would agree. I mean, not all of the Bayern Munich players were in the national squad. And in the early 70s, I mean, they were all world class. So that was a little bit of difference. And I just looked up your point with German domination in the UEFA Cup, and I have to say, as a so to say, local patriot, even Dynamo Dresden did not do a bad job. I mean, they could get too far. I think they're only to the second leg of the UEFA Cup, but played quite good results against the other German teams. And for Dresden, that was also a great team in the 70s with some spectacular games against Bayern Munich and other West German teams. But just as a footnote, sorry to interrupt you.
Now we come to the most successful season of the Breitner Rummenigge era, the 1980-81 season. The transfer activity was actually rather light. You have Branko Oblak leaving to join Spital Dro. You have Peter Grube going to the United States to Dallas Tornado. Later in the season, you have the Norwegian defender Einar Aas going to England to Nottingham Forest. He failed to make an impact. As far as the arrivals, you have Jürgen Rober from Werder Bremen, who would later become a manager for Hertha Berlin. Also played Nottingham Forest for a short spell, if I remember. You have Finnish midfielder Pasi Rotiainen, but he only stayed a few months before being transferred to Werder Bremen. And the main known arrival was Karl Delhai from Mönchengladbach. Bayern Munich would have a even more stronger season than the previous one, and they would win the league again against SV Hamburg. How was this season different compared to the previous one?
I remember it was a tough competition between Rummenigge and Burgsmüller, who was the most successful scorer of the season. Again, it was very interesting with Hamburg, the competition. But Munich was stable. I mean, I think in the mid time of the season, Hamburg was a bit better. It was up and down, but I think the system worked, what we have discussed over the last 30, 40 minutes, that everyone had his role. The elements came together, the Breitner spirit, and Rummenigge did, what did he do? 29 goals.
Yep.
That was fantastic. And Dieter Hönes. I think we also have to mention, at least for a moment, Norbert Jansson, He was at that time called the best substitute of Germany. Later, other substitutes were also very good. I mean, he scored, I think, the season before, he scored more goals, and later on he went to Schalke. But so they had a good mixture with the new players. I think Ars was a big talent. He never had success. Khaled Del Haye was a marvelous talent. Never had a great success. Räuber was a very good player. Could not get into the team. So the old championship team was dominating and stabilized. Augenthaler got better and better, and Horstmann too. And I think that was a success. In Junghans and Müller, I think both played half of the season, so to say. There, they only had success when they took in later on Jean-Marie Favre from Belgium. I never thought that Junghans is so bad, but they called him the Fliegenfänger because he made some mistakes. And then Bayern Munich is also a very critical club. If you do 2, 3 mistakes, you have no chance, and everyone criticizes you, and you're out. So I think one perhaps could have been trained Junghans perhaps on a different level, but he had not that standing. So that would be my interpretation of this very lovely and interesting season.
It was a great season. I think they really consolidated with the players they had from their championship title in 1980. And I just found out here is the from the kicker from the before the season 1980-81, and here they have main signing Kalle Del Haye in German national shirt, and it was a record signing. It was the first time a player cost more than 1 million Deutschmarks at that time. So there were high hopes, of course, into Kalle Del Haye, but he never took anything apart in Munich. I mean, he had a lot of injury trouble, and the talent that he had shown in Mönchengladbach, he could never bring on again at Bayern Munich. So I think then Paul Breitner really went to the system with Dieter Hönes and Rummenigge up front, and not playing with like two wingers on the side, and having more these two forwards right up front, and who were apparently scoring very well that season. And in midfield, he left everything as it was, with Wolfgang Kraus, with Bernd Dürnberger, with Paul Breitner, and in defense with Horstmann and Remmler and Weiner and Augenthaler. So it was a very consistent squad they had during that season, and they were just playing on a very good level. Of course, Bayern was also focusing or trying to get more success also than on European level. But I remember that very season, it was a semi-final. They went out against Liverpool. The semi-final, it was they finished because I think a certain Ian Rush played for Liverpool at that time.
We forgot to mention that in 1980, West Germany won the Euros with Rummenigge as one of the stars. And this in turn helped him to be elected as France Football's Ballon d'Or in the middle of this season. So at this point, was Rummenigge entering a different level and status as a player, becoming a bigger global star?
Yeah, I have a junior kicker, and here you see him with Maradona. That's a from 19.
81.
I mean, it's an article on Maradona, the child who plays for millions. Yeah, but that was his level. Rummenigge and Maradona. Yeah.
I think this was during the Mundialito in 1981, late
82.
1981. Yeah.
Oh, the Mundialito, you mean the World
Mundialito.
Cup winners,
Yeah.
which was played in Uruguay at
Late
Montevideo.
1980, early 1981. Yeah.
This actually event where they had so many scandals with alcohol and women.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
More than
Yeah.
No, but I think, of course, Rummenigge grew out because at the World Cup 78, he hadn't been a big player. I mean, scoring not very many goals. He didn't also score a lot. I mean, he was not the winning player in the final. It was Horst Rubesch with 2 goals against Belgium. In the groups phase, it was Klaus Allofs, the very young Klaus Allofs, coming up with a hat-trick against Holland. So Rummenigge wasn't the big goal scorer, but he played an important role in laying up the goals, for example, for Rubesch and for the others. Then, becoming the European Player of the Year was, of course, a very important, and of course in Germany also, the German Footballer of the Year award really gave him bright shoulders and also putting him into this level. I remember also in 1980 for the first time he scored the Tor des Jahres, the goal of the year in
Mm.
Germany, with a very fine trick against Bochum, where he held up the ball two, three, four times on his lap, on his leg, yeah, and turning around and then lopping it over the goalkeeper against Bochum. So that was also the first goal of the year he scored then. And I think through all these events, he came into a position, being a superstar and being the future striker for Germany. Yeah.
Pop duo from England made a song on him. Rummenigge, what a man. Sexy knee and whatsoever. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, but I think that was a bit later. I think that was
well,
80, 81, 82 or so.
incidentally, we discussed this in another podcast I did just days ago about the German national team 82-83 season. Yeah, so this was after the match at Wembley in October 1982 where Rummenigge scored 2 goals. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Another thing we discussed in that podcast with Breitner's brilliance in 1981, there was a clamor to get him back into the national team. Now the national team was as well under the Breitnigge duo. Was that just logical given how well they worked together at this point?
Well, I mean, the German Football Association was very conservative. I mean, both terms politically very conservative, but also structurally and mentally. And as I said in the beginning, Breitner was regarded as a left-wing intellectual, always critical, not diplomatic. No, I mean, there was a discussion in Germany. Should he come again? I remember my father didn't like him, and he said, it's a little bit unfair that he played another World Cup, and well, he makes only confusions and so forth. On the other hand, if you look at the 78 World Cup, they had Heinz Flohr, they had Neumann, and so forth. They had some very talented fielders, but all of them were injured. They had not stability. They had not this long-term success. And perhaps they had not the ego of Breitner, who said, I'm the boss, and here we go. Yeah. Blohr was very sensitive at Cologne. I mean, a wonderful midfielder. Overath was over. Netzer was over. So, I mean, again, the question is who could fill this role? And as we have discussed over the last hour, I mean, Breitner got, after his injuries, better and better. And so it was a logical question. I mean, who could be the next? And then comes something else into the game. I mean, at the Euro 1980, Germany had the wonderful, talented young midfielder
Bernd Schuster.
Bernd Schuster. Yeah,
Bernd Schuster.
and he was a very difficult personality with a very difficult wife. Was his manager, and they crashed with the Football Association. So again, a huge talent who could play perhaps even better than Breitner. I mean, he was out, and then there was Hansi Müller from Stuttgart, but he was also sometimes excellent, sometimes a bit shy. So Breitner could feel that there was a lack of a leader, and he filled the leader role, and that's why he came in again. But it was a harsh discussion. I mean, it was not that everybody opened the door and said, "Wonderful, Breitner is back." No, that was not the case.
Absolutely. I also wanted to mention this Bernd Schuster case because he was the most gifted or most talented player really in 1980, and then went off and went to Barcelona, and later I think he was one of the very few players who played for Barcelona, Real Madrid, and Atletico Madrid. So I mean he's played at all the three big Spanish clubs, but never played or only very late came back to Bayer Leverkusen to play once more in Germany. But yeah, he was, I think, even more rebellish than Paul Breitner back in the 70s, when he read the Mao Bible and was a Marxist, described himself as a Marxist and played in funny Spanish Western movies like Potato Fritz, Paul Breitner. So he was, I think Ben Schuster was a bit the young Paul Breitner, but with an even with his wife taking him out of that. And I think the German national team had only Hansi Müller, who was a young player, also talented. They had Felix Magath, but I think
Mm.
Magath was also too young. to really dominate the midfield. I mean, he grew into that position later, 83 with Hamburg, 84, 85 later in the 80s. But at that time, 82, he would have been too young to fill out that role. And so therefore, that's, I think, the reason why the DFB called Breitner back. And I mean, it wasn't an axis like in 1974. There were only 3 Bayern players in the World Cup squad for Spain in 1982. And that was Wolfgang Gremmler as a defender, and then Breitner and Rummenigge. So it wasn't the dominance that you have sometimes nowadays where you see, oh, half of the team is all from Bayern Munich. No, it was more from Hamburg, from Stuttgart, from different clubs. But I think this axis, Breitner and Rummenigge, yeah, played an important role to, well, finally reach the World Cup final at least, although the presentation of the team in Spain on that World Cup level wasn't always that good if we think about the games against Algeria or Austria. But but then when it came into the phase when they played Spain, when they played England, or played the semi-final against France, I think then Breitner and Rummenigge played an important role to finally reach the final at least. Yeah.
At the end of 1981, Rummenigge wins his second consecutive Ballon d'Or, with Breitner finishing second, just behind him. And incidentally, Schuster was third. Was this the height of the Breitnigge era?
Yes, you can say so.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, they worked so well together. If you watch that goal that they scored in Mönchengladbach in 1981, that was really absolute blind. You know, they knew he's running that way, and passing and sticking together. That was really the symbol. Okay, those two are very, very well connected, inspire the game and make it happen. So I mean, if you look at nowadays the Ballon d'Or and who wins it, then it's all from, well, different clubs. For years it was Messi or Ronaldo, but that 2 players from the same club finish first and second in the Ballon d'Or competition, I think that is very rare.
The closest we have is like in 1988 and 89, when you had 88, you had Van Basten, Hullet, and Rijkaard for the
Yeah.
first three, and in 89 it was Van Basten, Franco Baresi, and Rijkaard. So all three
Yeah.
AC Milan players.
I also ask a question, perhaps to both of you. I mean, I like this Rummenigge Breitner era, but I think that they didn't play this fine, astonishing football like the AC Milan you just mentioned, of
Arrigo Sacchi, yeah.
Sacchi or whatever time. Yeah, it was very good technique. It was clever played. I also think in the 1980 Euro, Germany was dominating. I think that the game against the Netherlands was excellent. The rest was okay. I mean, Rummenigge scored, I think, the first goal. I think it was a transitionary period for the German football. I mean, they worked through. Yeah, in '82 did a good competition. In '86 they did a good competition. I think Rummenigge was not very good in both tournaments. I was a little bit disappointed when I remember my childhood
Well,
memory
he was
right.
carrying injuries in both of them.
He was injured both of them, and sometimes he was a bit too egotistic. He was a captain, and instead of waiting a match, he always wanted to play, and sometimes he performed well, and sometimes he was grabbed, to be honest. Yeah. So I think Rummenigge, in a way, had 4 or 5 years. That was the peak of his career. I mean, in Inter Milan, he was not very good, and in the World Cup tournaments. In Spain, he was better than in Mexico, and he had some golden moments like the France match or the '86 final. I think there he did a good performance, but in between it was so ups and downs. Yeah? I don't know how you see it.
Well, I think in '86, I think they got very close to getting the title. I mean, being behind 2-0 to Argentina, yeah, after this horrible Schumacher
Yeah,
mistake at the goalie. They were 2-0 down against Argentina, and then coming back and Rummenigge scoring the 1-2, Rudi
yeah,
Völler scoring the equalizer, doing the 2-2, and then really putting everything up front, trying to score the winning goal in the last 5 minutes, and then getting the counter through Buruchaga, yeah, who's running away, Hans-Peter Briegel. I think that was they were very close to winning that title already in the Aztecan Stadium in Mexico that year, and I think they were close and they had the spirit. I mean, also beating France in the semifinal, who was obviously the best team at those times, I would say, after winning the Euro Championship in '84 and then going
yes.
out against Germany in the semifinal of the '86 World Cup. So Germany was playing, yeah, very, very clever and also not with super players, I would say. I mean,
No,
86,
no,
they
no,
had
no.
players like Norbert Eder as a defender who had just come the season before from Nuremberg to Bayern Munich, or yeah, Augenthaler, and yeah, so they were not. I wouldn't say world class at that time, but still they were with the attacking force, with Rummenigge and with Völler up front. They were close to it, to winning the title. Yeah. I think they was close. 82, I think, yeah, was a horrible tournament. And only with a lot of luck, they reached the final. And I mean, in the final in 82, they were chanceless against Italy. I mean,
Yeah,
it was only Paul Breitner, who's one of the very few
yeah,
players
yeah, yeah,
in history who scored in two World Cup finals.
yeah,
And
yeah.
but I mean, the semi-final, of course, of the
That
1982
is
World Cup,
wonderful.
that was historical. That is one of the games you will never forget if you've watched it. I remember seeing that, watching that on television and coming, yeah, back from 1-3 down against France. And again, it was Rummenigge and it was Klaus Fischer with the overhead kick to
Yeah.
Yes,
do the 3-all equalizer and finally reaching the penalty shootout. So that was a classic game.
for sure. We come to the 1981-82 season. Transfer activity. Schwarzenberg retires. Jürgen Rober leaves, joins Calgary Boomers. Norbert Jansson joins Schalke. And Joachim Benfeld joins Belgian side Mechelen. As far as the arrivals, we have Bertram Bierlorzer coming from Nuremberg. The Icelandic midfielder Asgeir Sigurvinsson coming from
Mm.
Standard Liège, who would not make an impact at Bayern, but would be brilliant with Stuttgart later on and win the Bundesliga title. This season, Bayern Munich, there's a drop off in the level in terms of the Bundesliga, and it's Hamburg and Köln of Litbarski and Fischer and Schumacher who edge ahead of Bayern Munich. Bayern finished third this season. And of course, they reached the Champions Cup final, which they were favored to win against English side Aston Villa, and they lose that match 1-0. And of course, Germany reaches the World Cup final with Rummenigge and Breitner as the stars of the team, and they finished second there as well. Was this kind of like the reference point where this era was over with this duo, or the beginning of the end, so to speak?
I wouldn't say that they were playing badly that season. And I think there was one very important turning point in that season. I mean, looking at the table in the end, in 1982, Bayern was only 3 points behind German champions Hamburg. But the decisive game was the 29th match day, and it
Mm.
was Munich Olympic Stadium. And we were 3-1 up against Hamburg until the 75th minute. I was listening on the radio to that match. Then, in the last 15 minutes of the game, Hamburg scored 3 goals. And in the 90th minute, the Horst Rubesch, yeah, after Rubesch had been fouled and was lying like dead on the pitch, and Hamburg got a last free kick, and then Rubesch somehow, he wasn't injured anymore, rushed up, ran into the box. There came the cross in, and he headed it home for the 4-3 winner. And I mean, if you look at that game, if Bayern would have won that game on the 29th match day, I would say Bayern would have become champions again in that very season. Yeah. So I wouldn't really say that it was the end of the era, Breitner, Rummenigge. I think with a bit more match luck on that very game, I think they could have won the title. And I mean, they reached the Champions League final against Aston Villa in Rotterdam, and they were, I don't know, 80% ball possession. They were the much better team the whole way through the whole of that game. And then just getting this one stupid goal through Peter With. I was very, very unlucky on that game. I remember Rummenigge hit the crossbar 5 minutes from the end. So, I mean, even that game, they could have turned around and maybe win even the European Cup that season. So I wouldn't describe that Breitner and Rummenigge were really at the end point in that season.
That's very interesting. I mean, that really rings a bell, and I have some memories and feelings regarding your story. I totally agree. I mean, Hamburg played fantastically at this decisive game, ups and downs. Rubesch was big star, and they had a squad like Bayern perhaps in the years before. So that was very fascinating. And then I mean the season was over. Then it was clear that Hamburg was confident to go through, and I mean they had the fantastic coach with Happel. I mean the cup final was very interesting against Nuremberg with Dieter Hoeneß heading something like a turban because he got injured. I mean that was a fantastic game. I still remember it. Rainy day in Frankfurt, and the Aston Villa match. I always thought, I mean, Bayern Munich needed decades to win the Champions League again, and the Breitnigge era could have been even more legendary if they had won the Champions League. So I think this era lacks the last success. It was a really big success, and it was a very equal match. I mean, it was not really a good match, and tactics of Aston Villa was very clever. I mean, it was not a very interesting team, but Bayern was not strong enough to take over, to make a goal and dominate the match totally. So that was perhaps so the last bit that Bayern didn't had at that time, and that so to say the final crown of the Breitnigge area was not possible to reach at that evening. And you know,
Yeah.
then in the later years, I don't know how was it for you as a child. And my father often allowed me to watch half of the semi-final, mostly against Liverpool, and it was all the 80s totally frustrating. Bayern lost all matches against British clubs: Aberdeen,
Absolutely.
Liverpool, Everton, Tottenham, Aston Villa. Oh my God, it was so
Everton, yeah.
frustrating.
Aberdeen in 1983,
E-
after winning the German Cup, Nuremberg,
Everton,
we
yeah,
played Aberdeen and then lost to a
Ferguson,
certain the
Aberdeen.
Ferguson.
yeah. Also Everton in 1985.
Everton in 1985. I was in England when that game took place. It was a 0-0 in Munich, and
Yes.
then
3-1 at Liverpool, yeah.
and 3-1 at Goodison Park in at Everton. And yeah, I was watching that game with my friend Neil in Southampton. We were so unlucky. I think 5 years in a row in 1984 in the UEFA Cup, we went out against Tottenham. In 83 against Aberdeen, 82 Aston Villa, 81 Liverpool. So no, it has not been a good a good half decade, and I agree. I totally agree, Roland, that that is the missing crown for the Breitnigge for those two players, and so astonishing that still they won the Ballon d'Or. Or Rummenigge won the Ballon d'Or, or they were ranked so high. Because if you look nowadays, oh, you have to win at least the Champions League and become a World Cup winner and win the European Championship title. And maybe then you name it Rodri or so, winning the European Championship with Spain, then maybe you can become a Ballon d'Or winner. But you see, in those days, obviously the people or journalists that were looking more on the quality of the players more than today when they take more into account the titles that those players win.
And in fact, Rummenigge's Ballon d'Ors were never disputed because many times you'll have situations where a player's Ballon d'Or is always disputed. Like it should have been this player or that player. But I remember it was universally acclaimed that Rummenigge was the best player in Europe at that point.
Yeah.
So we come to the final season of this duo, the 1982-83 season. As far as the players leaving, you have Hans Wiener, who joins Chicago Sting in the United States. Asger Sigurvinsson and Kurt Niedermeyer join Stuttgart. Later in the season, Walter Jankhaus, the young goalkeeper, joins Schalke. As far as the arrivals, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge's younger brother, Michael Rummenigge, comes from the youth side of Borussia Lippstadt. The eccentric Belgian goalkeeper Jean-Marc Pfaff arrives from Beveren. The former East German defector Norbert Nachweit arrives from Eintracht Frankfurt. The defender Bernd Martin arrives from Stuttgart. Midfielder Wolfgang Grube arrives from Eintracht Braunschweig. This season, Bayern Munich would be in the hunt for the title, rivaling SV Hamburg, but Bayern Munich imploded late in the season. With loss after loss, Pal Czernay would be sacked before the end of the season, with Reinhard Saftig having an interim for a few weeks. Bayern Munich would finish in the fourth position, behind Hamburg, Werder Bremen, and Stuttgart. In fact, when they lost to Schalke, Junghaus said this was Bayern's third loss in four matches towards the end of the season. Junghaus said that I have never seen Bayern this bad. Paul Breitner retired at the end of the season, and I think he was injured for most of the season anyway. But he retired to end a glittering career. In fact, his farewell match was that famous match against the World 11. This era was over. At the end of this season and at the end of this era, would it be fair to say that perhaps Breitner's presence brought out the best of Rummenigge and made him an even bigger star? And why do you think they were so complementary on balance when you look at this whole era?
I would suggest that Rummenigge was in his earlier years not that confident as he became later, and perhaps even much later when he was a president of Bayern Munich. And he comes from Westphalia. The people are there not so outgoing. So he needed a personality to stabilize him. And as a striker, he needed a midfield that supported him and brought him into action. Yeah, as you said, I mean, that was a congenious couple together with the other guys. I mean, and as we said, I mean, it was not a world-class team on all positions, Bayern Munich at this year's. And then, as I said, these puzzles, if they fit together, then it's okay. And if one of the puzzles breaks out, like Breitner getting a little bit older, I mean, Rummenigge was okay. I think he scored around 20 goals, but perhaps they needed another 2, 3 stars to reach the next level. This young Icelandic midfielder, he became very good in Stuttgart. But his time was not ripe in Munich, so he had to develop further. So they couldn't compete. And Hamburg was really very good with the zone-orientated defense, with Appel, who was always a very successful coach, but reached the top of his career with the Hamburg team, Günther Netzer as a very bright and clever manager. The competition was tough. Cologne was also a good team with signing Alofs, Fischer as a 2 forward, and Barski as a young, very tricky player. So that was an interesting time. And sometimes you go up and sometimes you go down. And then Bayern needed, I think, another 3 years with Lothar Matthäus, Sören Lerby, and then let's say, a consolidated Uli Hoeneß as a manager after 6, 7, 8 years in management. And they also needed, when a year later Rummenigge left the club, they needed a 10 million marks to pay the depth and to have a financial basis. So I think that was years in between again, and then one could argue what was this Breitner Rummenigge period? Was a time in between, so to say. Interesting period, but the stabilization then with the big success of Bayern Munich, winning more or less all titles in a row, that came later on with new stars. And Bayern had not the capacities to buy in so many absolutely premium stars as they could do in the later years.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's this in between period, as you said. I think later on, then in 1983, when Udo Lattek took over for the second time, then he created a second period, like he had done at the beginning of the 70s, when he won the championship and the European Cup in 1974 with Bayern Munich before going to Gladbach. And then Lattek coming back in the summer of 1983, then he created a new era, and with Søren Lerby, with Lothar Matthäus, and with really strong midfielders. But I think the problem in the 1982-83 season was that Breitner was injured very, very often. Wolfgang Kraus was a fine player, but he wasn't an international class player or a very distinguished player there. Nachtwey was someone who hit in between. He was solid in defense, but was also not the great playmaker. So I think they were really lacking that a little bit. And I think, I mean, just remembering the first game of that season, that is also this very
Oh,
historic
yes,
loss to
yes.
Werder Bremen, where
Oh
Uwe
yes,
Reinders does a throw in from the left side from 45 meters, throwing the ball onto the goal. And Jean-Marie Pfaff, in his very first game for Bayern Munich, just touches it a little bit with the hand and it flies into the goal. And so they lost to Werder Bremen. And I mean, if you look at the final table of that season, Hamburg wasn't that dominant. I mean, they were a world-class team and they won the European Cup and the German Championship, but Werder Bremen was even on points with Otto Rehhagel, just coming back up from second division, yeah, in the second year then after coming back from second division in Germany from the Zweite Bundesliga and then but having players like Rudi Völler. I think that is one of the big mistakes that maybe Bayern did. Völler was playing for 1860 Munich and they could have signed him maybe in 1982, 1981, 82 to get him for Bayern Munich. Yeah, then you saw at Bremen you had players like Reinders, like Völler, Johnny Otten, Neubart, Petzai. I mean, they're really good players they had there at Werder Bremen, and that was really an indication when they lost in Bremen through this very funny goal. They lost 1-0. Then later on, you saw how Werder Bremen, who had not played a role for ages in German football, then came up and nearly became German champions in that very season. I think there were just other very, very good teams. Actually, that season, 82-83, reminds me also a little bit of that season, 97-98. I remember I was at the first match day of that season, also at Olympic Stadium, and Bayern was playing against Kaiserslautern
Of
on the
Rehagel.
very first day, and Kaiserslautern had just come up from the second Bundesliga with a certain manager, Otto Rehhagel, who had also been the manager at Werder Bremen in 1982. And Bayern lost at home 1-0 to Kaiserslautern and never caught up in the whole season again to Kaiserslautern, and Kaiserslautern became German champions in 1998. So it's a very similar story, I would say. And yeah, just from this, if you lose the first match and then you never get on rolling, yeah, you end up and you do not win the title. But definitely the injuries of Paul Breitner, yeah. Made the big difference in that season, I would say. Yeah.
Getting back to Breitner's impact, was it a case of both sides needing one another for a revival, the club and the player?
yes, definitely. I think that's the point. Yes, I think that's the entire evening in a nutshell.
Rummenigge would stay one more year and leave in 1984 for that transfer to Inter. The Breitnigge era was officially over with him leaving. The impact with the national team. There was a feeling that Breitner, he may not have been a good influence on the rest of the team with drinking, gambling, but nevertheless setting an example by being the first on a training ground and always maintaining his level. And also later on, we hear like Rummenigge and Breitner were kind of the leaders and they could come and go as they please, and Yup Derval had no authority on them. How much of the stories do you think are true?
Well, I think that Paul Breitner was at that time, also as a young player, a bit a troublemaker. Like later on, Germany always had sometimes people like that, like Stefan Effenberg, who was sent away from the World Cup in '94, like a bit of a rebel, a bit of a player who's not obeying always to the rules. I think Karl Rummenigge, I don't know whether he was really a rebel, but maybe that has also got to do with his with the impression that people had from his first years of the career, when he was called the Red Cheek, the Rotbäckchen, who always got a bit nervous and in front of the goal and that I don't know whether he was really playing out the superstar. I mean, I can imagine that Breitner was a difficult personality. Probably, yeah, Jupp Derwal was not a very strong leader of that team. So when they finally went out at the Euro in France, which was, of course, you have to say, also very unlucky. I mean, it was the very last minute of the game against Spain when they lost 1-0. So if they would have, I think if they would have held the draw, the 0-0 draw, then they might have even got further like they always did also in 1982 at the World Cup. And nobody knows, maybe they would have reached again the final. Yeah. But I think he lost a little bit the grip on the team, Jupp Derwal. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I mean, they prepared in south of Germany for the '82 World Championship at a lake called Schluchsee, and then the newspapers called it the Schlucksee, the drinking lake, and a lot of stories with drinking, prostitutes, doing hobbies. I mean, there were a couple of big egos. I mean, Toni Schumacher was not a very charming boy at that time. Riegel, time were different. Today, when you read the papers, I don't know whether this is true. I mean, discipline and more discipline and no alcohol and all these stars seem to go to bed very early. I mean, I don't buy the story, but discipline is perhaps higher these days and more controlling, and social media was not existing. So they could do a lot. And yes, as you said, I mean, they liked the star attitude. And so they did things as they like to do. And the result is that they were not that fit and not that good at the '82 World Cup. Different times. And Derwal was a weak coach. Like a lot of the national coaches in Germany had not had the authority as they should have. I mean, there are some other examples, but Helmut Schön was regarded as an absolute expert, but a very shy personality. So I mean, Breitner and Beckenbauer and later on the other guys knew that they could do what they wanted to do as long as on the pitch they were okay. Different days.
In closing, what is the overall legacy of this duo at Bayern as far as the history of German football overall?
Well, I would say today we all would agree in saying Bayern is the biggest club in German history. And I mean, the '70s, they were extremely good, but it was not quite clear that over the decades they would become the dominating factor. So I think Rummenigge stabilized the club on a very high level without the Champions League success, but at least they reached the final. And that proved that Bayern Munich is a real factor German football. I mean, as I said, Hamburg had a brilliant team, brilliant manager with Netzer, who then had no fun anymore and left to Switzerland to a different job. Hamburg could have dominating club, but then they made a lot of mistakes economically, sports in signing the wrong players. It's a bit luck. It's a question of intelligence, of the right mix of people on the management side, on the football side. And I think this proved that Bayern had the attitude, but also the right feeling at the right moment to bring about good teams. And this continued over the years. And there, I think, in a long history, Rummenigge Breitner played an important role to show we take up this tradition and we bring the tradition to the future with success. I think this is perhaps a legacy.
Yeah, I would say that is, you described it very well, Roland, because they didn't have the super success as they had later on, with like winning now the Champions League titles or having Robbery, Arjen Robben, Frank Ribéry, and players like that, dominating the club for years and winning 11 times in a row the German championship and stuff like that, and Schweinsteiger and Lahm and all these players. But I think without Breitner and Rummenigge, the club could have gone a totally different way. Yeah, I think just with them bringing back the success, bringing back the interest, and then also selling Rummenigge for the record sum of 10 million Deutschmarks to Inter Milan, the club stabilized economically. And I think then, through that money, it was only possible to get people like Lothar Matthäus and sign players like that who took it further in the second Udo Lattek era in 1985, 86, 87, the three championships. And then they got this status of, okay, mir san mir, and we are the German champions. And okay, you have to be very lucky if you become a champion. But the usual rule in Germany is Bayern Munich is winning the championship. And I think that fundament was laid through this Breitnigge era, because after the big success, beginning of the 70s, when it was clear, okay, those were super world-class players, winning also the World Cup in 1974. Of course, it could all have gone down in 1978. And I think through those players and through the manager skills of Uli Hoeneß, then the club came into that position that he is in today.
With that, I would like to thank both of you for your participation in this interview. And all our respective contact information is on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you very much for this very informative interview. It brought back a lot of memories for me as well as a young fan of that era, and hope to continue these discussions on German football history. So thank
It
you
was
once
a
again.
pleasure. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.